Lesson number 9, education. Um, if you go back to way back to the first lesson, we learned about social forces. You know, things that affect us by influencing our perceptions, our beliefs, and opinions. Included among them are government, media, entertainment, commerce, social media, including something called social reality, which has a huge effect these days. Also, our culture affects the way we see things. Education, there's the one we're going to talk about. All right, so education is a social force, and it's a social force because it influences perceptions and beliefs, gets inside our head, and influences the way we see things, and thus controls our cognitive reality, which is the only reality we know, right? And thereby it then affects our actions or inactions. Now, one of the things that is taught in education is U.S. history. All right. The manifest function or overt function of U.S. history is to teach us what happened, but the salient function of U.S. history in many cases is to create allegiance to the country, create belief in our goodness as a nation, and to make us feel good. Right. With that thereby the public is easier to manipulate. That is, it's easier to get people to accept and support the policies and actions of the government, despite their real purposes and their adverse effects, and despite issues of morality, issues of right and wrong, which for me is the bottom line. Now, so an example of U.S. history which is taught is the Civil War, and most people are taught that the Civil War, the primary purpose for the Civil War was to free the slaves, a noble and good cause, which would make us a noble and good nation, right? But what was that? Was that the real reason for the Civil War? So let's examine what the causes for the Civil War were. Now, the roots of the Civil War really go back to the Industrial Revolution, which was a big game changer, right? Industrial Revolution brought machine production of goods, right? With machine production, you can make things better, and more importantly, you can make far greater quantity or far greater volume of products, right? Why that's important is because the vast majority of wealth in producing and selling goods is in something called value added, right? And let me try to explain value added. All right, here's an example. Now, value added is value that's added to a raw material. Here's a raw material, wheat grain. It's processed a little bit, converted into flour, and that flour is then further processed and made into a cake. All right. The raw grain by itself, raw material, is priced at about 30 cents a pound. Flour, on the other hand, is a little bit pricier at 50 cents a pound. So by processing it one step, you increase the value of it and you can sell it for more, right? However, a cake, if you look online, if you go to Google shopping, you see that cakes are priced at between $40 and $60 for a cake. So the vast share, the lion's share of profit goes comes from making a finished product. That's called value added. That's where the big bucks is at, and that's in a manufactured good. Another example is a car, right? Here's a big pile of iron ore from which you make iron, from which you make steel, right? Here's a car called Bugatti Chiron. It's base priced at $3 million per car, right? The price of this car is far greater than an equivalent amount of iron ore, far greater. So you get far more from making a finished product. Okay, now, the situation back then was the first nation to industrialize in the Industrial Revolution was Great Britain. They had a jump on everyone. So they had a position of dominance. And they wanted to maintain that dominance in being the monopoly producers of manufactured goods. So to do so, what they would do is underprice their competition, driving them out of business, right? And here's an example. Well, let me explain the relationship between the United States here and Great Britain at that time, right? So the United States was a producer of primary goods, like the raw wheat, cotton, wood, sugar, tobacco, grain, so forth, food, right? shipping them to England. England, on the other hand, would produce and sell manufactured goods, clothes, tools, guns, iron goods, right? And it was through making these manufactured goods where they gained far greater profits, all right? Now, business interests in the United States saw that, and they wanted a piece of that manufactured goods. They wanted a piece of that value-added profits, right? So, but the situation was this, all right? Britain had an advantage in industrializing first, and so they can make things cheaper and more efficiently. So, if a United States company wanted to make a saw to cut lumber, and Britain was making a similar saw, in fact, a saw of identical quality, they can make it and sell it for $1, let's say. The U.S. company, the new upstart company, not as efficient, could make it and sell it for $1.15. Now, given this situation, no one's going to buy the American good when they can buy an equivalent saw just as good for a lot less over here. So that would cause the American company to go out of business, right? Now, with that situation, the American company pleaded to the government to impose a tariff, a protectionist tariff, all right, to help protect their infant industries. Okay, so let's say they imposed a 30% import tariff, all right? Now, the U.S. company can still make and sell their product for $1.15. Britain, on the other hand, because they got to pay an extra 30%, could make and sell their product for $1.30. Given this situation, well, no one's going to buy the British good, and thus the American manufacturing company will prosper and survive, right? So that benefits the northern industrial interests up here. However, that killed the southern cotton trade, and here's how. Oh, let me get this set up again here. All this money, these represent pound notes, and they belong in England where they're made. Okay, so British pound notes. All right, now, here's the situation. Great Britain over here was the first to industrialize, and the first industry to develop manufacturing machine industry was textiles, making clothes from cotton, right? Okay, so here's the situation. Great Britain is first to industrialize. They have all the factories for mass producing cotton clothing, all right? However, the climate of Great Britain is very poor for growing cotton. So they have to import cotton from somewhere else, and a great place, which was perfect for producing growing cotton, was the South in the United States, right? So to get that cotton, what they would have to do is take their British pound notes, right? Here's like a 50-pound British pound note, and send it to the United States, okay? And then once it's at the United States, they would exchange the pound notes for dollars, and then use the dollars to purchase cotton, ship the cotton back to Great Britain, which they would use to manufacture clothing, and then make a lot of money in selling finished goods, a finished product with value added. So all these pound notes are coming over to the United States, being sent over, like this. All right, all this money, boom, over there, piling up over here. All right, send a bunch over here. All these piles of money. These represent piles of British pound notes. Send a few more over. Okay. Now, if money isn't recycled, it's all going to pile up over here. To recycle money, get it back over to Great Britain, that means that U.S. Citizens or people in the United States would have to take the British pound notes over here and use that to purchase British manufactured goods. However, with the high tariff, no one's buying British goods, so that created a situation in which pound notes keep being sent over, but not returning, right? Now, as more and more British pound notes pile up over here, and no one's using that to buy British goods, right? With that big excess supply of pound notes, the value of these pound notes plummets. It falls. It's worth less, right? Each pound note is worth less. So because of that, the southern cotton growers demand of Great Britain more pound notes per bale of cotton, which means they demand a higher price for the cotton in British pound notes, right? So it's raising the price for Great Britain to buy cotton. So they just say, well, okay, well, we'll just go somewhere else. So they went to Egypt and they went to India, right? Another situation is, if you look at this, there's only a couple, there's less money left in Great Britain. And this would cause a scarcity of currency, a scarcity of capital, right? And that would drive up interest rates, which would hurt the British economy. So they're hurt in a couple of ways, a number of ways. So they go overseas, right? And they get their cotton somewhere else. Now, because of that, the sales of cotton in the South plummets, right? They're getting hit bad. Their revenues, their income's getting hit bad. They're not making money, right? Now, as their cotton sales plummet, the amount of cotton in the United States is building up, right? So now you got this huge pile of cotton building up. As more and more cotton builds up in excess surplus, the price of it falls. So the southern cotton producers are hit a couple ways. One, they lose volume of cotton sales because they're losing exports to Great Britain. And two, the price of each unit of cotton is falling. So they're getting a double whammy. But who's benefiting from this? The North, because with all that cheap cotton in the South, they can purchase that cotton and better compete with Great Britain making textiles, along with the import tariff protecting them. So the South is being hit in a number of ways. One is it's killing the volume of cotton sales, it's killing cotton price, and they're also paying a higher price for manufactured goods. All right, so here's a summary. Okay. British send pound notes to USA to buy cotton, right? US enacts a tariff. British goods become too expensive. No one buys British goods. So pound notes do not recirculate. The supply of pound notes in the United States, let's see here, starts to build up again. Remember that big pile of pound notes, right? That causes the value of pound notes to fall. Southern cotton growers need to raise price to the British to make a profit with lower value pound notes, right? Britain says, well, forget it. We'll just go and get our cotton from India or Egypt, right? Southern cotton sales fall. Southern revenues fall. Supply of cotton increases, price of cotton fall. Southern revenues fall further, but this is all great for northern textile manufacturers. So that's a big conflict point between North and South. All right, get this out of the way here. Okay. Now, so tariffs were a big issue, right? And here's the history of the tariff battle. There was a key battle lines between North versus South, right? The first tariff of our country was actually written into the Constitution. The Constitution was ratified in 1789, right? It was a 15% tariff. Now, the next big tariff increase was in 1816 as part of our war effort against Britain in the War of 1812, right? Now, for patriotic reasons, the South went along and supported the tariff because it was a tariff against Great Britain, who we were at war with, right? So the first big tariff increase was in 1816. Now, right away, very soon, the Southerners realized that this was a big detriment to their cotton industry, right? Then in 1824, a bigger tariff was passed when Northern and Western political interests who had similar interests, same interests, right? They held a majority in Congress and they passed a high tariff, right? The tariff battles began in earnest from here on out, right? And every time the Northern and Western political interests held majority in Congress, they passed a high tariff. Whenever the Southern Democratic Party held a majority, they would pass a low tariff, okay? So that's 1824. 1828, 4 years later, Northern and Western political interests still hold a majority. They passed an even higher tariff, which the Southerners hated so much they called it the Tariff of Abominations. All right. Now, This brought a lot of conflict, a lot of heated, arguments here. And in 1832, to reduce the tensions, the northern and western controlled Congress passed a reduced tariff, right, to help mollify or to appease or to assuage or soften the outcry of the South, right? And they also promised that within 10 years later, we'll reduce tariffs to 20%. All right. Now, South Carolina was not appeased, however, and they threatened to not pay federal taxes, federal government taxes, and they threatened to secede, and they took actions to defend Charleston Harbor from federal closure. Now, this is the very same threat that initiated the Civil War. If you recall from your history, the Civil War started when the Southerners started to fire upon Fort Sumter, which was a federal U.S. government fort. All right, so let's take a look at Fort Sumter. And the idea is, the Civil War almost occurred in 1832, and the cause of that was tariffs. All right, so let's see here. Let me do this. All right, get rid of this. Okay, so here's the port of Charleston, right, in South Carolina. South Carolina, big state running this way well. Right, here's the idea. All right, now, if South Carolina refuses to pay federal taxes, the federal government has to do something about that. They can't let any state not pay taxes, or no one's going to pay taxes, right? So one thing the government can do is invade all of South Carolina, right? Send their armies and take over every inch of South Carolina, every farm, everything, right? But they don't have to do that, right? All the government has to do is shut down the key strategic choke point, which is the port of Charleston, right? All the goods that are grown and produced in South Carolina are shipped to the port of Charleston through rivers or over roads, mostly over rivers and through rails at that time too, right? To the port of Charleston, put on the boats, and then shipped overseas. And cotton's going to Great Britain, right? All right, so to shut off, to shut the port of Charleston at the time of the Civil War, all the federal troops had to do is to control the Fort Sumter, which is right in the mouth of Charleston Harbor. So by holding this fort and positioning cannons, they could sink any ship trying to get in, get out, right? So that was the first action by the South after they seceded. That was to take the fort of Fort Sumter in the mouth of Charleston Harbor, right? And you see them, bombing it here. Now the same situation occurred in 1832, right? Exact same strategic situation which was the threat of shutting down Charleston Harbor. Okay. So the key is the Civil War almost occurred in 1832, and the issue was tariffs, not slavery. All right, now in 1842, the long-awaited 20% tariff goes into effect, right? Make the Southerners happy. But almost immediately after going into effect, the Whig or Northern Control Party, the Whig became Republican Party, Northern Control Congress passed a 40% tariff, doubling it, right? However, in the 1844 election, the Democrats came to power, and right away they passed a reduced tariff of 25%. Democrats are still in control of the House, or in 1857, and they passed an even lower tariff, of 17%. Then, in May of 1860, the Republican-controlled House passed the moral tariff, the jack-up tariffs. However, the Senate was controlled by the Democrats, and they blocked any vote. They stalled on the vote. They delayed in the vote, and they blocked any vote on the moral tariff. Okay, so summary. Key battle line was tariffs. Tariffs are important because they determine economic fortunes. Who's going to thrive, north or south? Industry versus agriculture. The new way of making wealth or the old way. Democrats controlled, whenever the Democrats controlled Congress, they would pass lower tariffs. Whenever Republicans controlled Congress, they would pass high tariffs. Now, in the election of 1860s, the Republicans won a clean sweep, winning the House, Senate, and the President, right? Which would open a door for passage of all the Republican economic agenda. We'll talk about that in a second, including the moral tariff. All right. Now, as soon as this happened, the southern states started seceding, and they were crying, the North is trying to free the slaves. The North is trying to free the slaves. We gotta secede. But was that true? Is there evidence for that? So let's take a look. Right. This is commonly accepted in history, but is there real evidence for this? All right. Now, despite anyone saying oh, there's abolitionists, right? Right. I mean, there's a lot of issues with that, right? There's abolitionists, but did they want war, right? There's abolitionists. There's people who are abolitionists. Well, I'm not going to get into that whole issue, but let's start here. There was no evidence of threat to abolish slavery. Slavery was written into the Constitution. Okay, so slavery was written into the Constitution in two places. One was a 3/5 rule in which slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of representation. All right, so a black person in the South who was a slave would be worth 3/5 of a person in terms of how many congressmen you get in the South. In the South, right? And it was also written into a fugitive slave clause that was written into the Constitution. So what that meant was, in order to eliminate slavery, you needed a law. But it wasn't just any law. It was an amendment to the Constitution which requires a 2/3 vote. So now, because you need a law, you'd have to have a bill before Congress, right, before you can even have a law voted upon, right? But there was no bill before Congress to free the slaves, right? Now, even if there was a bill, which there wasn't, there was not the political will or power to free the slaves. For example, on January 31st, when they passed the 13th Amendment, freeing the slaves, at the very last minute, at the 11th hour, right, that bill only passed by 2 votes in the House, which means that with only northern states, southern states, we're at war with the South, so southern states are out of Congress, right? Only northern states are in Congress, and with only those northern states, they still barely wanted slaves to be freed, right? It won by only 2 votes. Which means that before the war, when the southern states were part of Congress, there was no way such a bill would pass. And on top of that, given the fact that the vote in January 31st of 1865 was done while the war is going on, the war itself is no longer a factor, meaning that before the war, right, given the fact that a move to free slaves would cause a war, no one would vote for that before the war. But in 1865, with the war going on, so the war's not a factor, it still barely passed by only 2 votes. All right, now there's more to it, right? The Northern Republicans bent over when the Southern states started to secede from the Union. The Northern, and crying, "Oh, you're trying to free the slaves! You're trying to free the slaves." The Northerners said, "Well, no one's trying to free the slaves. In fact, they bent over backwards to avoid the war by passing the Corwin Amendment, guaranteeing states' rights and guaranteeing the right for people to have slaves." Right? So they're saying, "Please keep your slaves. For God's sake, keep your slaves." Right? No one's trying to free your slaves. And they also offered to have the New Mexico Territory be admitted to the Union as a slave state. All right. So let's take a look at New Mexico Territory. All right, here's the New Mexico Territory. It's in the south. Here's the southern border of Missouri. Right, here's New Mexico. And this territory was very poor for slave plantation. It was basically desert. It wasn't suited. And the Northern said, take it, please. All right. So, given the fact that they passed an amendment guaranteeing the right to keep slaves, and given the fact that they offered New Mexico to be a slave state, that's not trying to free the slaves. That's the opposite of trying to free the slaves. They're guaranteeing slavery and expanding slavery, right? Okay, next thing is this. Now, once the Civil War started in 1861, there was no move to free the slaves until 1865, right? However, what the Northern Republican-controlled Congress, after the Civil War, it's only the Republicans in Congress, right? Only the Northerners are dominant in Congress. What they rushed to do is they rushed to implement their economic program, right? And it sheds evidence on what the Civil War was really about. So what happened is this: as soon as the Civil War started, as soon as the South seceded, they passed the Morrill Tariff, the tariff I was talking about, in March of 1861. Then, right on the heels of that, they passed national currency, legal tender act, right? There wasn't a national currency. There wasn't a U.S. dollar back then. There was multiple currencies that were being passed around, right? Then in 1862, they passed the Homestead Act, free land for anyone, 160 acres, right? This was part of the Republican political agenda. All right, and then again in 1862, they passed the Pacific Railway Act, right? Funding for 3 transcontinental railroads. All right. Shortly after that, in fact, the next day, they passed the Morrill Land Grant Act, right? Set up colleges for the scientific use of natural resources, right? Purpose of this was to increase the effective utilization of natural resources, from soil to water and timber, cattle, whatever. Increased knowledge of engineering and construction of railroads, bridges, roads, mining operations, things like that. So we'll talk about this more in a second here. And the last bit of legislation involving their economic agenda was to pass the National Banking Act, establishing a national bank to facilitate the control of currency and interest rates to help investments and so forth. Okay. Last thing is the Civil War unleashed Western expansion economics, all right, which was the engine that drove the economy until 1893. All right. So, again, there's no evidence of an attempt to abolish slavery. Even when they tried to abolish slavery, they barely passed with the Northerners alone, right? They took actions to guarantee slavery. So the North was not trying to abolish slavery, right? And when the Civil War started, they didn't rush to free the slaves. Instead, they rushed to implement their economic agenda. Now, let's take a look at the political reality at that time, right? And this is a big motive for why the South seceded, right? Okay, as you can see here, I have here writing on the wall. All right, now Europeans were immigrating into the United States in waves, all right? Between 1840 and 1860, swarms of Europeans were coming to the United States, and 9 out of every 10 of them went to the North, all right? Why? Well, the North had factories, they had job opportunities, right? The North promised to have to provide free land. Okay, now, because of this, by 1860, the demographics were such that the northern population was twice as big as the southern population, slaves included, right? And slaves only counted 3/5 of a vote. So, according to demographics, the North held the greater power for potential congressmen. Now, the demographic prognosis for the future would only get worse, right? More and more people would flood to the North and not go to the South. So the balance would shift towards the North as far as the number of congressmen, right? Now, the last 4 states to be admitted to the Union all went free, right? And that meant that 8 more senators were from free northern interests, okay? So the idea is this: each state has 2 senators to represent them, all right? Since the Constitution was written, there was a practice of if a state entered the Union as a slave state, then a state would enter the Union as a free state to maintain the balance between North and South. 2 more senators in the South, 2 more senators in the North. However, you couldn't resist people who if the people of a state wanted to go free, you couldn't resist that, right? And the last 4 states, all to be admitted, all went free, swinging the balance in favor of the North in the Senate. All right, now next thing is the South had succeeded in forcing slavery into the North, right? But it ran into the stone wall of popular sovereignty, right? And let's take a look at that issue now. Failed Southern efforts to force slavery into the North. Well, why did it fail? Okay. 1820. First thing is 1820 Missouri Compromise. No slaves in the Louisiana Territory north of the southern the South Missouri border. So let's take a look at that. Here's the southern border of Missouri, right? According to the Missouri Compromise of 1820, no slaves would be allowed above the what was called the 36.5 northern latitude line, right here. No slaves above here, and all this territory was the Louisiana Purchase territory. So no slavery above there. Okay. Now, in 1852, the South won a victory called the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which effectively nullified the Missouri Compromise, and it introduced popular sovereignty north of the 36.5 latitude line in the Louisiana Territory, which was the Kansas-Nebraska area. So here's Kansas, here's the Nebraska area. So all this territory, slaves can now be admitted into. All right. So the South won a victory there. Then in 1857, the Dred Scott case, the ruling of it essentially legalized slavery in Northern Territory. Okay, so the way it was open for slavery in the North. Okay, however, the Kansas-Nebraska Act stipulated that slavery would be admitted into the Kansas and Nebraska Territory under the principle called popular sovereignty, which means only if the people wanted it. So if slavery was to be admitted into the Northern Territory, the people would have to hold a vote, a referendum, and they have to vote in favor of it. However, that wasn't going to happen because the vast majority of people in the North didn't want slavery, right? Now, do they not want slavery because they're nice guys? Maybe, but in most cases, it was self-interest, right? 4 reasons why Northerners didn't want slavery in the North. Slavery would steal jobs. If you bring in slaves, right, it would take away jobs, just like it did in the South. That was a key reason why the white people in the South were poor, dirt poor. Slavery stole jobs. Also, it would lower wages. It would drive down wages. For example, if slaves come in, what are people competing with? 0 wages. That would drive down their wages. So it would steal their jobs, drive down their wages, and it would steal land opportunity, because if slavery was allowed in the North, who had the greatest financial wealth to gobble up that land, to purchase all that land? Well, it was the rich southern plantation owners who were rich as literally as princes and kings in Europe. They had the money. They would come in and gobble up all their territory, turn it into slave plantations, right? So that was a threat to the average person, right? It would steal jobs. It would lower wages. It would steal land opportunity. Whereas the Republicans promised free land. You can have free land. We'll give it to you free, 160 acres, right? Now, as far as the rich industrial manufacturing interests, the rich owners of factories, they didn't want slaves, right? They believed that wage labor was far more effective. Wage labor was more effective in producing hard-working, productive people. Wage labor was necessary to provide consumer power, right? So that they could purchase the manufactured goods these guys are manufacturing. If no one had wages, then no one could buy the goods they're producing. So they believed that wages was the key engine which would drive productivity and consumption, all right? It wasn't about, we want to free the slaves because, they didn't want slaves in the North, right? That didn't mean they wanted to free the slaves in the South. That's a totally different situation. We want to keep slaves out, right, because it's going to steal our opportunity, right? But we're not going to go so far as to try to free the slaves in the South because that would cause war. All right. All right. Now, except for two territories, Oklahoma and New Mexico, the overwhelming amount of independent territories, these territories here, would go free, right? So here's Oklahoma, and that was Indian territory, right, at that time. It was promised Indian territory. And here's New Mexico territory. This territory was desert, right? It was totally unsuitable for a slave plantation type system, right? And here is the Utah territory, which is really Nevada and Utah, right, which is also desert, right? I didn't know that. It says here that it was slave territory. I didn't know that, but not the case. These were very sparsely populated, low density of people, right? It's only desert territory, right? And Oklahoma's Indian territory. The vast majority of territory you see is going towards free, right? Including already California and Oregon were at that time free states admitted to the Union, including Kansas was a free state in January of 1861. All right. Okay. Now, another factor in which the writing on the wall for the demise party power was the fact that on the eve of the 1860 election, the Democratic Party split into three: Northern Democrats, Southern Democrats, and the Unionist Party, dividing their power. All right. Now, the moral tariff had already passed the Republican-controlled House in the spring of 1860. With the 1860 election and a clean sweep by Republicans, there was no stopping passage of the moral tariff, which would kill the Southern cotton plantation economy. So what happened was Southern states immediately seceded. And when they seceded, crying, the North is trying to free the slaves. All right. However, that wasn't true. So why would they cry the North is trying to free the slaves? All right. This is my assessment, okay? And I'm going to show you evidence to back it up, okay? Evidence that the Southern elites were used racism to manipulate the poor Southern whites, who were the vast majority. I'll just get down to what I think happened, all right? Okay, so with the 1860 election, the writing's on the wall. The Southern Democratic Party is done, right? They're going to lose power. If they lose power, they lose control over legislation. If they lose control over legislation, they lose control over tariff bills, for example, and that's going to kill their cotton industry. It's going to kill their cotton trade, right? That's going to kill their whole economy in the South. That's going to kill the source of wealth for the rich Southern plantation owners, right? So their only hope, right? It was only going to get worse. So their only hope was to check out of the Union, and to check out of the Union meant to secede from the Union, right? To secede from the Union meant war. Now, the people who were driving this, who were behind this, were the rich plantation owners, right? Who were really that 1% or less than 1%. They were just a small percentage of the population. The vast majority of white people in the South were dirt poor white people, right? And now these rich plantation owners, that 1%, couldn't fight the war by themselves. So they needed to get the support of all the poor white people. And to do that, they used the threat of freeing the slaves. So there was no real effort to free the slaves, but they shouted that to rally the white people to fight the war for them. All right, so this is some evidence that this was something that was ingrained in the South. The manipulation of racism was used over and over again in the South. The first instance was Bacon's Rebellion, where Back then, I think it was like 16 something, 1640 or something like that, or no, it was not that, 1690 or something like that. Anyways, in Bacon's Rebellion, there wasn't only black slaves. There were Irish slaves and there were also English slaves. And all the slaves got together, no matter what race, and they fought against their owners to get their independence, right? So in response to this threat, the wealthy slave owners utilized racism as a means of dividing and conquering their opposition. So by emphasizing race and superiority of whites, they helped split the whites away from the blacks, the slave whites from the slave blacks. All right, and then the plantation owners strove to convince poor whites to overlook how they were being exploited by the slave economy. Remember we said that the slave economy basically stole jobs, drove down wages, right? Took land opportunities away from them, right? So while poor whites earned little money, they were given instead something called a psychological wage, right? Made to feel good. They were treated with deference, admitted to public functions, allowed to vote, made to feel superior simply because of their whiteness. They're superior as a people because they're white and not black, right? To keep poor whites from forming coalitions with enslaved blacks, the white elites had to, quote, teach whites the value of whiteness, right? Thus, white elites fueled white superiority as a means of divide and conquer, to keep the poor whites from forming coalitions with blacks. All right, now there was no political move to abolish slavery, as we said, right? This was manufactured by the Southern elites as a scare tactic to manipulate the poor Southern whites to fight for them. The rich plantation owners knew the political reality down here, that they were done, right? It's only going to get worse. So the only way they could maintain their system that brought them great wealth was to secede from the Union. To secede meant war, and they were too few to fight, you know, the 1% or less than 1%. Therefore, they needed the Southern masses, the poor white people, and just as they used racism in the past to manipulate the masses, they used it again as a scare tactic to mobilize poor white people to fight. So if, the idea is this, if there's a fear that blacks are going to be made free, then those blacks could compete for jobs, right? Take away jobs from whites further, which they're already doing as slaves, but they could further take away jobs. Also, it would drive down wages. There'd be competition for homes. There'd be competition for goods, all right? And the big thing was that the whole thing with that psychological wage, right? They, you know, slaves would be equal to them, all right? So racism was emphasized for divide and conquer after Bacon's rebellions. Racism was emphasized to keep poor whites content in their exploitation and poverty. Racism was emphasized in the Civil War to get poor whites to fight for the white elites, the plantation owners. All right. Okay, so I think I covered everything here. Let's go down to a few more things. Well, let's talk about this now. So this is the Republican agenda. We'll cover this again when we, okay, Republican agenda was here. Before the Civil War, Western expansion, expanding west, was bottlenecked or blocked by north-south competition over political power. Remember we said that the tradition was, since the Constitution was written, that if a territory in the South went slave, then a territory in the North would go free, to make a balance in the Senate, because each new state would represent two more senators, right? And then you'd have so many congressmen based upon the population size within that territory, right? Okay, so it was a fight over political power, but that competition, that struggle, restricted expansion into the West. However, with the Civil War, the cork that was blocking Western expansion was released, and between the Civil War and 1893, when the economy crashed with the Great Panic of 1893, that was the greatest period of economic growth in U.S. history, called the Gilded Age, right? Driven by Western expansion. And what was driving it essentially was, as we drove out west, we had access to more lands and more resources. Those resources were being shipped back to the where they were needed and utilized in the industrial East, right? Fueling the industrial East, right? And to pay for that, money was sent back over here. That money created disposable income, created consumer power, which was used to purchase goods. So that money was cycled back to the east, right? And then manufactured goods were sent here. All the material needed to build the little towns that popped up along the way. All the material that they couldn't make out here, right? If a woman wanted a fine dress or fine china or silverware or whatever, right? Guns or tools, right? That could be manufactured over here, sent out there. Now, this was essentially the same thing that the Europeans did when they colonized foreign territory, when they formed colonies, right? They would go into territory, develop trains, right? The utilization of resources, right, and the manufactured goods and the cycling of money drove the economy, including the manufacture of infrastructure, trains, transportation, right? Now, a key concept in economics is called the velocity of money. The faster the money circulates back and forth, grows the economy. This increases gross domestic product, or the size of the economy. All right. So this is really the Republican plan, right, to grow out west and just drive the economy, and it did. For a period of almost 30 years, it really drove the U.S. economy to the greatest growth in its history. All right. So here's a way of visualizing the whole Republican economic agenda. The key elements were high tariffs. We talked about that already. Free land. That's what the Republicans said. Free land, free labor, right? Right. Get a national bank to make credit more available. Get a national currency to get more stable transactions, more predictable transactions, and thus grow the economy. To get land grant colleges for the scientific utilization of resources and for the building of transportation infrastructure, roads, bridges, railroads, and so forth. Okay, so let's take a look at this. We'll start here with free land, right? The idea of free land came with the Free Soul Party, which was headed by a guy named Salmon Chase, who is now the namesake for the Chase Manhattan Bank, right? And he proposed free land and free labor, wage labor, right? Now the purpose of free land were multiple here. So one is, if you offer free land to the average person, right, they have opportunity, right? Now, this is a more effective way of utilizing human resources, human talent, human energies, effort, ingenuity, right? Increase human incentive, right? Give these people opportunity, increase their incentive, right? Increase their drive, their energy. It's a more effective utilization of human resource as a resource, right? Okay, now another aspect of free land is it would release the cork on the problems of overpopulation in the East Coast. Now, we said that immigrants were flooding into America, right, causing a problem of overcrowding, right, overcrowding and insufficient housing, insufficient jobs, poverty, right, leading to a lot of gangs, ethnic gangs were forming, and they're fighting, and there's crime and so forth, right? Now, if you offer free land, that would release the pressure here. Those people would have opportunity to leave the urban centers, right, in New York City or Boston or whatever, and go out west, okay? So decrease problems with the influx and flood of immigrants and urban overcrowding. Now, another thing free land would do would undermine the Southern Democratic Party, would undermine the power of Southern plantation owners. If you offer land free, then the people who had the greatest wealth and resources to gobble up and purchase that land were the Southern plantation owners. That would take that away from them because you just offered free. Okay. Now, another factor was if you offer free land, right, people would go out and populate that land. They would cultivate that land, use it for farming and so forth, right? Now, that was important in consolidating and controlling land taken away from Indians. There were two things required to seize land away from Indians. One is you need military force to kick the Indians off or to kill them, right? But that wasn't good enough because you can kick them off, but you can't occupy them militarily forever, that territory, right? So what you need is a civilian population to take that land and to cultivate it, converting it from grazing land, which the Indians used because they hunted deer and buffalo, so forth, which were dependent upon grazed land, and to convert that to farmland, cultivated, plowed farmland, which the deer and whatever buffalo wouldn't use. So it would take away the food source from the Indians, and thus you control that land. So whatever land you take away through military force, you then consolidate and control it and secure it by cultivating it, turning it into farmland. And then the next thing is with free land, you have increased, stakes for gold prospecting, mining, gold, silver, whatever, right? Even other materials like iron ore and so forth, lead, right? But for gold, for the sake of gold, it would be have an impact upon the money supply, right, and national currency. Okay, so let's go to here. Okay, so free land increases opportunity, increased incentive, drive, increased utilization of human resources, but that increased utilization of human resources resulted in increased utilization of natural resources, right? But to ensure that these people, with their drive, utilize those resources smartly and don't waste it and destroy it, like you can have soil erosion, water, wasting water resources, and improper animal husbandry, right? They wanted to establish these land grant colleges to increase knowledge, to more effectively utilize resources, and also to build the transportation infrastructure needed to get all those resources in the West back to the East Coast, right? So, so with this, you had increased production of raw materials, building materials, more food needed to support the manufacturing and industrial society in the East Coast, right? So this is driving production, right? All the resources are needed to fuel that production. All right. But to get that stuff back to the East Coast, you need to build railroad construction, build railroads and build the trains, right, and train cars, right, to transport both goods and people to support commerce, right. But this itself became an engine that drove production, drove our economy. So this drove manufacturing. This drove manufacturing. I should have an arrow here. Then you had increased consumption with all the operations out here and demand for manufactured goods. Now, that was also driven by the fact that there was wage labor. So wage labor is the next thing we'll focus on, right? With wage labor, that gives people incentives. They get paid for their efforts, right? Their efforts, the amount of work they do, they're compensated for, right? So it's incentive, it creates drive, as opposed to slave labor, which, all you're doing is trying to avoid getting the whip. Right now, also, in addition to that, just as important is the fact that when you have wage labor, that creates disposable income, consumer power. People can purchase goods. If people can't purchase goods, that won't drive manufacturing industry. Industries would fail. Manufacturing industries would fail. So it requires people to have wages. And this whole thing drives the economy. Incentive, wages, right? Consumption, production and consumption. Now, in addition to that, you need to protect our industries. So we needed high tariffs. That's what the North wanted. All this resulted in economic growth. But the key thing is, another key element is money, because money is the universal exchange commodity. If it wasn't for money, everything would erode back to a barter system, which is very ineffective. Okay, for example, if you're, let's say, a pea farmer, right, and there's no money, and you want to buy a computer, well, how much peas do you have to, exchange to get a computer, right? Depending upon what quality of computer and so forth, right? Depending upon, the market for peas and all sorts of things, which makes transactions hard. Money simplifies it. Money is a universal exchange commodity, making it simple. But the problem here back then was there wasn't a national currency. There wasn't a uniform money. Every bank issued its own bills, its own notes, which were money, right? So then you had to exchange notes between banks, right? And exchange rates could fluctuate, making things uncertain, unstable, right? If you have a single national currency, that creates predictability. That predictability brings confidence in a transaction, which facilitates economic activity, right? Plus, you have to expand the money supply. So you have to have a stable currency, a trustworthy currency, and you have to have enough money, and that increases trade. With increased trade, you need to have expanding money supply, right? And expanding money supply increases access to credit, but a key factor in that was a national bank to facilitate access to credit, to control interest rates, and so forth. Okay, national currency would also decrease risk, and that would increase the likelihood of investments, right? So all this is increases the likelihood of investments and transactions, all right? And that grows our economy. So all these were key elements of the Republican Party, and like I said, that's what they rushed to do, right? Moral tariff passed, national currency, free land, Homestead Act, Pacific Railway Act, transportation up here, right? Transcontinental land-grant colleges, national bank. One thing I didn't mention is with railroad construction at that time, given the fact that railroad technology, the engines were steam engines, all right, which didn't retain the water, didn't recycle the water, just blew the water out as steam, right? So the limitation on train range was water. Every 20 miles or so, they had to have a support town with a watering station. But what this did was this created demand for development of these towns, right? So as the trains moved out, it also established towns. Towns developed along the way. Every 20 miles along the way, as a watering station, as a post office, as a telegraph station, as a place where you collect your agricultural and building materials, whatever, and put them on trains to transport east, and as a point of distribution of goods coming from the east. It was basically an outlet store, right? And every town had a dry goods store, right? And that dry goods store, you could purchase anything basically, even though the stuff on stock was limited because they had the Montgomery Ward's catalog. And the Montgomery Ward's catalog back then was the same as Amazon.com today. If a woman wanted a fine dress or fine linen or silverware or china, anything nice, they can buy anything you want, right? Through the Montgomery Ward's catalog. So that facilitated consumption, and which facilitated growth in the economy. All right, now, last thing I want to talk about is the Emancipation Proclamation, right? Emancipation Proclamation is often spoke about as like this very important thing, which that was the real key thing in ending slavery, right? That's a bunch of bunk. The Emancipation Proclamation, we said that slavery was written into the Constitution, right? So in order to end slavery, we didn't just need a regular law, right? A simple majority. We needed to have an amendment to the Constitution, which requires a two-thirds majority, two-thirds vote, right? And now the Emancipation Proclamation wasn't a law, wasn't an amendment, right? Wasn't even a law. It was just a proclamation, which is a statement. So it's a president of the United States waving a magic wand saying, I said so, because I said so. That's it. Now that may be good during war, because when we're at war with the South, laws don't apply. They don't get the benefit of laws. All right? We can do whatever we want to them. So president says this, yeah, we'll do it to you, right? But after the war, if these states were to come back into the Union, they would have to have the vote, right? And all those slaves who were freed would go back to being slaves, right? Unless there was a vote, because of the fugitive slave law was on the books, right? So any slaves that escaped the South, went to the North during the Civil War, if the 13th Amendment wasn't passed, well, they had to be sent back down and become slaves again, right? So it was limited in, another way it's limited is this. Not all slaves are freed. Only the slaves in the rebel states, the secessionist states, were said to be free. Border states here in purple were all slave states who remained with the Union. So in the proclamation it says, yeah, all the slaves down here are free, but you know what? The slaves here in Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, well, you're not free. So it wasn't about really free ending slavery, right? It was limited. And it was only during time of war, okay? Fugitive slave law, real freedom. So it wasn't really an effort to really end slavery. What this was more a strategic move. The idea behind the Emancipation Proclamation was, well, the core power of the Southern economy was the slave plantation, especially cotton farming, right? Now, if you offer freedom for the slaves, right, that would encourage slaves in the South to escape to the North, all right, and that would undermine that would take labor away. That would undermine the Southern slave economy, which is the fundamental basis of fighting a war, is economics. And also, in addition to that, all those able-bodied young black men who are escaping the South and go to the North, right, they can be trained as soldiers and put into army units, increasing your war fighting capability, right? So that's the strategic move, right? Undermining the economy, resources, right? Getting personnel, manpower, right, to fight, okay? All right. So the Emancipation Proclamation had very limited effect as far as ending slavery. All right, no, it's overemphasized. Okay, and like I said, the 13th Amendment, the second 13th Amendment, the first 13th Amendment was a Corwin Amendment, which guaranteed slavery. Well, you can't keep that in the book, so you replace it with another 13th Amendment, which emancipated slaves, right? And that passed the House on January 31st of 1865, only by 2 votes, right? Okay. All right, so use this lesson to complete the homework questions, and we'll discuss this a little bit more in class.